Hi, I'm Mel Boudrot. Currently, I'm president of the New York branch of Screen Actors Guild, and we're here in New York at the offices of the Guild. With me is Dick Moore, who, in the immortal words of Andy Warhol, had his 15 minutes of fame, except that they spanned some 13 years, from 1931 to 1944, with a body of work that encompassed more than 100 films. But they neither started nor ended there, as you're about to hear. Dick, when and how did your career actually begin?
Well, it was 1926. I was 11 months old, and we had no connection with the movie business at all. But my mother's best friend was Joe Schenk's secretary, and he was the chief executive at the old Fox Studios. And the story goes, and I'm not sure I believe this, Mel, and I certainly don't remember it, but I've read about it and I've heard about it, and it was kind of the mythology in my family. That it was raining one day, and Aunt Ruth, she wasn't really an aunt, but you called your mother's friend's aunt, and she called the casting director to pick her up because her car was broken down. And he came by and he saw me playing in the playpen in the living room, and he said, "Oh, that child looks exactly the way John Barrymore must have looked when he was 11 months old. And we're shooting a film called The Beloved Rogue." Of course, this was silent. "And he has to be in it." And my mother ostensibly said, "Oh, no, perish forbid. My child could not be in films." And they said, "Well, it pays $5 a day." And those were big bucks. So anyway, the story goes that I got the job. And I had large brown eyes, and that kind of became a trademark as I got older as a child actor. And the script called for me to lie in this crib and cry, and they were supposed to give the child wine to show how he became a rogue in later life. And Barrymore, although certainly not in the scene, was on the set that day. And he looked in the crib and he saw me with my kind of staring up at the lights, I guess. And he said, "Oh my God, it's an owl," and turned around and walked off the set. And they then offered me Coca-Cola to look like wine. And my mother ostensibly said, "Oh, no, my child cannot drink Coca-Cola." So they finally decided on prune juice, which looked like Coca-Cola, which looked like wine. And they gave me a bottle of prune juice, and I drank it, and my career was launched because I didn't screw up the shot. That's how it all began, and then it kind of matriculated from there on. And eventually I was earning $7 a day, and then I was earning $9 and then $12, and at the peak of my career, I got up to about 20. No, I'm kidding. It was a little more than that. I had a unique experience in terms of being a child actor, or a child star, if you will, because I was so seldom under contract. And that was remarkable in itself. For example, Roddy McDowall was almost always under contract to 20th Century Fox. Elizabeth Taylor and Jane Powell, although Janie was older when she started, but even so, they spent their careers at MGM. So did Rooney and Judy Garland. I was a freelance actor for almost all of my career, with the exception of about a year and a half or 2 years at Warner Brothers, and then a stint with the Hal Roach Our Gang comedies, now called The Little Rascals. And I'd had a lot of experience in feature films when I went into that. I didn't stay long. I wasn't a regular member of the gang. But I never had a sense of being famous, and I think one of the things that was best about my life that contributed to that was the fact that I almost always went to public school when I wasn't on the set. Now, it was dreadful in terms of trying to acquire an education, and I flunked everything just about until I got to college, when I was determined to make up for that, and did. But my grades in grammar school were abysmal, because I would be off doing a film for 6, 7 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, 2 weeks, depending on the size of the part that I had, months sometimes, and then come back to the fifth grade at the Carthay Circle School in Los Angeles, and wonder where I was in terms of the advancement and what tests the rest of the class were taking. And so that was very difficult, but it was very good in that I didn't lead the traditional studio life. I didn't spend my life in the Little Red Schoolhouse as Mickey and Judy and Elizabeth and Jane and others did, where they would have 7 kids in one room, all in a different grade, and with no real relationship to each other. So my peers and my playmates were children who were not in films. And I think that was very healthy, but it also prevented me from getting too big for my britches.
How did they react to you?
I had a very good time in public school. They reacted fine to me. Of course, I was always very anxious to make friends and to please everybody. I think that is characteristic of most of us who shared that experience of being child actors. We were very anxious to please, anxious to make friends, anxious to make nice, to create a family. And I had no difficulty. I do remember wanting to be in the Boy Scouts, and I did join the Boy Scouts when I was 12. And I was very disturbed and self-conscious because I still wet the bed when I was 12. I wet the bed until I was 13, 14 years old. And I couldn't go on the camping trips, which is really what I wanted to do because I was embarrassed. And I remember I always wanted a sleeping bag, and my folks wouldn't get me one because I wet the bed. And I remember being gone from the Boy Scouts for 10 straight weeks. I missed the meetings for 10 weeks. They met once a week, the troops. And they call them Boy Scout troops, which is like a squad, a collection of, young kids. And I came back, and the dues were $10 a week in the Boy Scouts. And I came back after 10 weeks, and the first thing that the scoutmaster said was, "Where's your $1.10?" And I didn't have a $1.10. And I went home, and I asked my mother, I said, "They want a $1.10 before I can go to the next meeting." And she said, "Well, that's ridiculous. You shouldn't go back." And so I didn't go back. So there were things like that were not typical of experiences if you're always there. But by and large, I had a good time in school. I enjoyed it. I got to be head of the safety committee at the Carthay Center School. You wore that little badge, and I was a terrible tyrant. I was just awful. I arrested people for everything. Probably because I couldn't do it on the set.
How did your teachers react to you?
Some of them were terrific, and some were not. I had a couple of teachers in junior high school who that I had trouble with. One of them especially, I remember feeling terribly mortified, accused me of trying to be too charming. Well, she might have been right, except I didn't know how to be charming. I didn't know what that really meant. And she attributed that to my experience as an actor, which kind of made me feel ashamed of being an actor. But most of the teachers were terrific. Those of us who worked as child stars were almost always driven by economics, especially in the 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. Most of our families desperately needed our incomes. The number of people who brought their kids to Hollywood from God knows where or who were in Hollywood and really, really, really wanted those children to be in films, were driven, I think, as much by economic need as there was a desire to create a star in the family. There was some of that. And Natalie Wood told me one time that she thought we were all products of our parents' unfulfilled ambitions and dreams. And certainly that's true. And Natalie had given a great deal of thought to this and was a very, I'm sure you know, thoughtful and brilliant woman. But I know that I can remember when I was working, my dad going out and looking for a job. He worked at a bank. And coming home at the end of a day during the Depression and after pounding the pavement and looking for a job that paid $18 a week and unable to get one. And at a point when I was making hundreds of dollars a week and maybe 1,000 or so. So they needed the money that we earned. And as we got older, there was more realization of that fact and more resultant pressure and less pleasure in the task, I think. That's a factor I think is often overlooked when people are kind of analyzing this era and what it meant and who these kids were and why they were doing this. But it's a very important point. I think one of the kind of landmark films that I did as a child was probably Oliver Twist. It was the first sound version of Oliver Twist. I was about 5 or 6. Coogan had done Oliver Twist as a silent film. And Jackie Coogan, and he had many wonderful memories of that he shared with me later when we got acquainted as adults. But Oliver Twist was kind of a benchmark, really, in terms of my career as a child actor. There were others. There was Son of the Gods with Richard Barthelmess. There were a lot of other films. I had the good fortune to work with really famous people. There was The Blonde Venus with Marlene Dietrich, and of course, that was very famous because it was one of Cary Grant's very, very early films, if not his first. And then there was the Edna Ferber, So Big with Stanwyck. I had the good fortune to work with really very well-known people. And, of course, that never hurts.
Oliver Twist, do you have real memories of making that film?
Yes, I have some. I have some memories of making Oliver Twist. I remember the porridge scene in the orphanage, where Oliver comes up and he says, "Please, sir, may I have some more porridge?" after eating the first bowl of gruel. And everyone is astonished, and he's punished for presuming to ask for more. I remember that scene. I remember a scene being dropped through a window because Fagin was teaching us how to rob houses. And the adults couldn't fit in, so they used me to squeeze through a window and then open the door so that they could get in and rob the house. I remember that scene. And then I remember a scene in which I was shot because the owner of the house awakened and didn't know who was down there. And I remember they had stuffed all these blanks into this old flintlock pistol. And I remember this huge cloud of black smoke and ash kind of descending all over the set as they were supposed to have shot me. I have certain memories of that. I remember the director. I remember being asked if I minded eating the leavings off the table after the adults had finished dinner. And the line was, "You don't mind eating the leavings from the table, do you?" And Oliver says, "No, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you." And I recall that scene. I remember little bits and pieces of that picture.
In the mid-30s, you did what we call now a series called The Little Rascals. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, Mel, The Little Rascals, now, I think they call them The Little Rascals now. Then it was called the Art Gang Comedies. And it was Hal Roach, and Hal Roach had his own independent studio. And he had done a great deal. Harold Lloyd was under contract to him, Laurel and Hardy. And, of course, the Our Gang comedies were a staple. And they ran, Spanky, I think, was the most widely known and the longest running of all the people, all the kids in the Our Gang comedies, or what are now the Little Rascals, Spanky McFarlane. And I worked with Spanky. The series began before 1930. And Spanky told me later that it ran until 1945 or 46. Astonishing. It wasn't really a series. It wasn't episodic. Each film was self-contained. Its own plot, like a sitcom. And I was brought in about 31 or 32, I think, to kind of hype up the gang. I was the only person in the gang who, prior to their experience there, had done a significant number of feature films and brought to that an identity that wasn't just associated with the gang. And I think they thought I'd hype it up a little, like a guest star kind of thing. But I stayed 2 years, and I was under contract to Roach for 2 years. And we did a lot of things that I thought were interesting, but not much fun. Everybody said, "Oh, what a great time you must have had with the Our Gang." I didn't. I didn't really enjoy it very much. There wasn't a very great camaraderie among the kids, except between me and Stymie. We became very, very close friends. He'd come over to the house and spend the night, and I'd go to his. And there was an empathy there. We reestablished contact early in the 1980s when I was working on a book about all this, and kind of took up where we left off. But I was struck by some of the plots of the Our Gang comedies. Things that were supposed to be funny struck me as sad. And there was one thing, for example, where we were all saving up our money to try to buy my mother a birthday present, and it wasn't a very good present. And there was supposed to be a lot of laughs. But I remember thinking about it later on and crying. I responded in a very different kind of way. But one thing about it struck me as really awful. And nobody thought about it at all. Nobody. And I asked Stymie about this later on, and even he hadn't thought about it, because we were kids, 6, 7, 5. And that is the racial stereotypes that were in the Our Gang. I mean, there was one episode where a chimpanzee was identified as Stymie's brother. Now, can you imagine doing that today? But nobody thought anything about it. Nobody did anything about it. It just was shot and went out, and I think I'm the only one that thought it was strange. There was another, the Wild Man of Borneo or something. They were just awful. And I asked Stymie about this later when we were adults, when we got back together and were talking. I was interviewing him for a book I was writing. And he said, "Well, Dick, yeah, I guess so." He said, "But we were kids then, and we were doing child things." That was his phrase, child things. And I did not feel offended. There's another thing about the gang, which is perhaps on a happier, more positive note, that I'm not sure I understand. And that is the immense and lasting appeal that it has had for 4 successive generations. My parents were avid fans. My generation, my son's generation, he's now 45, and my grandchildren, one of whom is 12 and another is 16, all watch The Little Rascals. And they all seem to think it's great. I don't get it. I frankly do not get it. Do you?
No. But I'm amazed at it.
Yeah.
It's being shown around the world still.
Apparently, because I still get fan mail. Believe it, I haven't acted since 1957. I still get fan mail. I get about 10, 15, 20 letters a week. And can you imagine somebody who hasn't acted since 1957 still has to send out pictures occasionally? But anyway, and almost everybody alludes to the gang. That's the thing that they're most curious about. And Spanky McFarland, Spanky and I got acquainted again. He was something else. Later in the early 80s, when I was talking to all these people, as I mentioned, digging them up and searching for my past and for the common themes and the things that we felt in common. Basically, I was working on a book that sought to portray, which was published and which was well received. It sought to portray the studio system through the eyes of its child actors. And that's why I wanted to meet all these people again and talk to them. Some I'd never met, some had just influenced me. But Spanky McFarland, I remember going to a dinner at it was an Academy Award. And then there was a dinner afterwards. And then there was a tangential event at which a lot of celebrities were gathered and actors, and each one was introduced. Bob Wagner, RJ, was the master of ceremonies. And the room was filled with people. I mean, really well-known people, all the way from Elizabeth Taylor, on down to the likes of me and a lot of folks, maybe 200 of us. And we were each introduced, and as we stood, the spotlight shone on us. And the largest applause in the room was received by Spanky McFarland. And this is not 10 years ago. I think that's quite wonderful and remarkable.
Amazing, absolutely amazing.
I remember Dietrich, of course, very well, and von Sternberg, who directed The Blonde Venus. They were so funny together. They obviously were very close, Marlon Dietrich and Joseph von Sternberg. And this was The Blonde Venus, I guess, was about 32, 33. And I played her son. And they each had brand new Rolls-Royce town cars, where the chauffeur would sit in front and there was a window in between. And he got rained on if it rained, but nobody in the back did. You remember those kind of cars? And hers was gray and his was black. They were identical. And there was a great rivalry between them. And he would say, "Dickie, I must take you out in my Rolls Royce and show you how much faster it can go than Marlena's." And she would say, No, my sweet, no, that is not true. My car can go faster than his. And there's this whole thing going on the set the whole time. And it was wonderful. I remember we did a scene once. She was very, very dear to me. And her daughter, Maria, whom I've met since then, of course, was on the set and was a bit older than I and was very affectionate and used to pick me up and hug me all the time. And I just hated that. I just thought, what is this girl doing? 5, 6 years old, you don't like that. Little did I know that you get to like that. And but I recall that one scene we took 143 times because von Sternberg did not like the backlighting on a beaded curtain. He couldn't get it the way he liked it. And we were coming into a room, and there was also a big dispute because he wanted Marlena to throw her hat on the bed as we walked into the room. And she said, no, that is bad luck. I will not do that. Well, this took a day and a half to resolve this. And it was amazing. And finally, the head of the studio arrived on the set with his whole entourage and demanded that von Sternberg stop delaying the shooting and that they get on with it, and reminded him that they were over budget and stuff. And von Sternberg simply closed the set. He said, unless you leave this set, he said, I am the director, you are not. Unless you leave the set, we're finished shooting for the day. So the man, I forgot his name, but he was the head of the studio, was totally undone, had no way to know how to deal with this, and marched off the set toward the main administration building, the front office. And my little dog, I had a Scotty, a Scotch Terrier that John Considine, a producer, had given to me. And he was on the lot that day. I was permitted to bring him on the lot. And as the head of the studio was marching off the set, my dog ran up and bit him. And it made the papers. Of course, it was reported in the papers. And the man, head of the studio, went to the front office and resigned. And my mother felt very guilty about this and very, very concerned that I would be blackballed because my dog had caused the man to resign, which of course the dog did not. But that's one of my main memories of the Blonde Venus, which was a really very pleasant and interesting experience. And in those days, they had these wonderful, huge, long 50, 100-foot tape measures that were attached to the underneath the camera because they couldn't focus that accurately without knowing the precise distance. Technology then, of course, wasn't what it is now. So each time they're lining up for a shot, they'd pull the tape measure out and hold it up against your nose and say, 27 and a half feet, and they would make whatever adjustments they made, and they would shoot the scene. And I always admired the tape measure. I was really very taken with that. And the last scene in the picture, when von Stromberg said, "Print it," he walked over to the camera, he unhooked the tape measure, and he gave it to me. And I had it for about 30 years. I don't know what happened to it.
That's some souvenir.
Yeah, it was.
Did you have any sense of the fact that you were working with legends or legends in the making and that you yourself were becoming a legend?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I never... No, I don't think so. I had a sense of doing work, and I occasionally felt a sense of pressure. But that's so dependent on the director and the whole atmosphere, the whole environment on the set that a director creates, really. Now that I think actors have more control, I think the top stars generate that environment as much as the director does. But in the days when I was most active, it was the director who created the environment on the set. And sometimes it was wonderful, as with Ernst Lubitsch or Howard Hawks, and sometimes it was terrible. And you felt a real sense of pressure. But in terms of being famous, no, I never knew that. I think that there's a sense I got of that once was when I went with some kids, some neighbors, boys in the neighborhood. We took our dimes on a Saturday afternoon to see some Westerns at the Fairfax Theater, at Fairfax and Melrose, I think, in Los Angeles, near where I lived. And the manager of the theater saw me coming with 5, 6 kids, and we all had our guns in our holsters, our cap pistols and everything. We weren't going to shoot them, but we wanted to have them, and a rubber hunting knife and all that kind of stuff, which we loved. And he saw us coming to the theater, and he said, "Oh, Dickie, you and your friends can come in free." Well, boy, that was a big deal, of course. But that's one of the first experiences I had of being different, of feeling different.
Do you have a favorite film?
Well, my favorite film was Sergeant York. I think it was 41. How old would I have been? 14 years old. 41, 42. But the atmosphere on that set was just so incredible, so wonderful. Howard Hawks was the director. I remember when I got to be in my early teens, I became very self-conscious as an actor. I knew intellectually exactly what had to be done. I was always very good at figuring that out. And for most of my life, 14 years, I had been completely free to express, to fulfill the requirements of what I thought the part was. And even at an early age, you do have ideas about what the part is. Or just to follow the director's direction. And then when I got to be about 14, I got very, very self-conscious, very stilted, very frightened. I couldn't laugh easily, and I found it difficult to smile. And I would read a script, hoping, as I turned each page, that the character would not be required to laugh, because I knew that would make me very, very uncomfortable and very self-conscious. And I got on the set of Sergeant York. They shot it once, and then Hawk said, "Okay, hold it just a second. Hold that." And then he came over and he said, "Dick, can I talk to you a second?" This was the very first day of like 5 months of shooting for me. And he said, "Dick, there's something that's really important for you to understand. I love the way you did that scene. It was perfect." He said, "But one thing that's terribly important to understand about George is he never needs to smile. Never." He said, "If you feel you want to as we go through it, okay, do it." He said, "But it's not called for. Let's shoot it again." Well, he had never met me. I had never met him. But instinctively, after one take, he went to the core of my insecurity and made it well, and totally freed me to do some of the best work I've ever done. And I'll never know how he did it. But when you say, what is my favorite picture, that has to be it.
Is that the reason?
Well, it certainly created the climate, the environment in which I functioned with great comfort. Another reason, of course, was just the people. Walter Brennan. Walter Brennan said, "Dickie," he said, "don't ever be a star." He said, "Don't ever be a star. If you ever have a choice, don't ever be a star." He said, "Coop and I," and I think they'd come from Montana together as cowboys. I mean, they went back a long time. He said, "Coop and I go out together." He said, "Nobody knows who I am." He said, "It's wonderful." He said, "He can't move. He can't do anything." He said, "If this picture flops, Dickie," he said, "they're not going to blame you or me. They're going to blame Coop." He said, "I get $50,000 a picture." Well, this was 1941. That's a big deal. He said, "And I do whatever I want to." He said, "Don't ever be a star." And then, of course, he went and did The Real McCoys and became a star with the president of the Screen Actors Guild at the time, Kathy.
Can you remember what pictures you were doing at that time, which is post-Sergeant York?
Yes, Heaven Can Wait. This was a Ernst Lubitsch production with Gene Tierney and Don Amici and a marvelous, wonderful cast. It was a comedy. It was a great, great comedy, one of the first Technicolor films. And Lubitsch was directing. And I played Don Amici as a youth. And as an even younger youth, Dean Stockwell played me, playing Don Amici as a youth. And Amici grew up to be an old roue, and I was sort of a roue in waiting, at age about 15 or 16, trying to, come on with the ladies. I remember Lubitsch especially. And he always had a piano on the set. He was a brilliant pianist. He'd been a classical pianist. And I said, and he played all between the setups. He would play the piano. And I said to him, "Mr. Lubitsch, you're one of the most famous film directors in history. You're always busy. How do you find time to practice the piano?" He said, "Dickie, let me tell you something." He said, "This is a very funny town. This is a very funny business." He said, "I may not have a job next year." He said, "And I always feel that I can go to a cabaret and fall back on playing the piano."
Now, you were a teenager at this time.
Yeah, I was about 16. I thought that was pretty funny. He also said another interesting thing to me. He said, this was Technicolor, and it was, one of the first big Technicolor spectaculars. And he said, "If you ever become a director," He said, take a little advice from me if you don't mind. He said, Technicolor is wonderful for musicals and for this kind of a film. Funny, lighthearted, wonderful film. He said, but when you become a director, he said, never shoot a drama or a mystery in Technicolor. And as you look back to the Citizen Kanes and the Maltese Falcons and the really classic films that have to be in black and white, I kind of marveled at that advice that he gave me in 1942. I was so happy to be in the Army, I can't describe it. I couldn't wait to get into the Army. And they tried to get me a deferment at Fox because there was something else they wanted me to do, and I had to come back and do retakes on something. And I was at Camp Sibert, Alabama, getting basic training, and they called and said, this is, you're getting to go back to Hollywood. And I said, oh, no, sir, no. And they couldn't understand it. And the story came out that I was a war hero because I didn't want to leave the Army, which was palpable nonsense. I just had found a home in the Army. And anyway, they finally agreed. The Army finally agreed with Zanuck that if I got out to do this job, they would ship me to my point of embarkation so that I could rejoin my company and go overseas with them, which I did.
You wrote for Stars and Stripes.
Yes, I did. I became a forward area correspondent for the Stars and Stripes, which was a wonderful experience because it in a sense, defined the rest of my life and working career. And it was the first indication that I ever had that I could do something else, that I knew how to do something else. Most of us were programmed, even if unconsciously, to believe that we couldn't do anything else. And most of us couldn't do anything else. I remember Roddy McDowell told me when he first came to New York, as a young man in his early 20s. He was doing that era, doing before Camelot and before No Time for Sergeants, those big Broadway plays that Roddy was in, with such success. But when he first came to New York, he didn't know how to shop. And he was going up for a part, and he wanted a pair of Adler elevated shoes, they called them at the time. Did you remember those?
I wore some.
Okay. And he went into the store, and he didn't have a check, and he didn't have a credit card, and he didn't have enough cash to buy the shoes, and he didn't know how to buy the shoes. So he called Vincent Sardi at Sardi's restaurant. And Vincent said, Roddy, have them delivered here COD and come and get them. And I will put it on your bill. So he did. But none of us knew how to do anything. I knew more than most because of my public school. We talked about that. I'd gone to public school, and then the Army, of course, was, I learned a lot.
You were discharged when?
I don't know. I was on Saipan, Tinian, Guam. After the war. It was after the war. The war was over.
And you came back to where? Hollywood?
I came back to Hollywood, yes, and I made the mistake of moving back home. My parents were not ogres. My parents were very nice, unsophisticated people. But I should not have moved back home. And then I became ill almost immediately thereafter. I apparently had picked up a bug, some virus in the Pacific, because I was all over the Pacific, the Western Pacific. And I went to the Sawtell Veterans Hospital for quite a long stretch, at which time I was represented as a war hero. And I was not a war hero. I was somebody who'd gone to the Army when he was drafted. And people came to visit me. Barbara Stanwyck came to visit me in the hospital, and Marlene Dietrich, and it got a lot of press. And so I was offered jobs again. And I had no money. Well, as soon as I got out of the hospital, I was offered a job, and the doctor said, well, you know, he's not in really very good shape. And the film was a film called Out of the Past with Robert Mitchum. And I was to play a deaf mute. And I did. And the studio, RKO, was just wonderful. They sent a tutor to my home every day for 6 weeks to teach me the deaf mute sign language while I was on full salary. And then we all went up to location in Lake Tahoe and shot the movie. And that's another favorite film of mine because I like Mitchum so much. And Jacques Tourneur, the director, was one of the 4 or 5 best directors I've ever worked with. I defined good directors by those who freed me from my own inhibitions. And he was certainly one of those.
So, in fact, you reestablished your career after the Army.
Unwillingly. I really wanted to be a writer. And I went to Los Angeles City College and studied every journalism course I could get on the GI Bill. Because I had no money. I couldn't have afforded the tuition, even for that. And then I came to New York to do a play, and I went on the road, and I began to do a lot of television, and I sort of moved to New York, and then went back and did 2 films for Stanley Kramer, Member of the Wedding and The Sound of Hunting, with Richard Kiley, and was kind of bounced back and forth, as actors do, between New York and Hollywood for a while, and finally sort of rooted in New York.
And when did your career change from acting into writing?
I had written some television stuff that got produced. And I had been the editor of the college paper. And I had, by the time the war ended, some experience as a correspondent for the Stars and Stripes. And I had edited the college humor magazine, which wasn't very funny. And then at the persuasion of my friend Ralph Bellamy, who at the time was president of Actors Equity in the mid-'50s, when I was living in New York. And I was working with him on a series called Man Against Crime, which he was shooting under the Guild's auspices out at Yankee Stadium. And we got to talking, and I was complaining about treatment that I'd received at Actors Equity in California when they wanted me to join, and I didn't have the money for the dues. And he said, you should be on an equity committee, and you should be on the council. They need young people like you who are not happy with the status quo. Would you be willing to serve? Sure. So I served on the Equity Council, which, as you know, like your job here at the Screen Actors Guild, and like all the members of the board and all the officers at the Guild and at AFTRA and at Actors Equity are unsalaried, and for which I give you great credit. Because I know what a pain it can be. And I got to be a member of the council, and I was on their publications committee. They wanted to revamp their magazine. And I wanted to get what I thought would be an honest job. So I was in the mimeograph room at that time. They had mimeographs. Cutting a resume that I'd written so that I could send it out to people and try to find work as a writer. And the executive secretary of Actors Equity at the time was a man named Angus Duncan, and he strolled in, and he saw me using the mimeograph machine, and he sort of wondered why. And he glanced at what I was doing, and he read the resume. And he said, oh, well, our editor, Alfred Harding, is resigning. We don't have anybody. Would you be interested in putting out a couple of issues until we can find someone? You're on the committee anyway. And I said, sure. Oh, I'd love to. So they gave me a desk, and I put out a couple of issues, and I put out a couple of more, and then they gave me an office. Then I got a secretary, and then I was on the staff. We created a public relations and legislative program. This was in the 50s and early 60s. And we changed the magazine, and became widely noticed. The New York Times used to reprint from us, which was a great compliment. And I quit the council, of course, because I was on salary. And I stayed there for 6 or 7 years. And then I moved on to other things.
When did you join the Guild?
Your 60th anniversary issue, in which I'm really thrilled to appear as a Guild founder. I hadn't realized that I was. But I think they identified my membership date as 1937. The Guild was formed in 33. I remember we were talking, Mel, and I think signed its first contract in 34. And I didn't join until 37 because my folks were very thrifty, and I think they probably evaded paying dues for as long as they possibly could. I would have liked to have joined sooner. I think I'm card 800 in the low 800s, but I would have liked to have been, number 20 or 30.
During your peak, the peak of your career or of your fame, did you have any realization that you were a member of a union?
No, I did not. I knew. No, I didn't really. I had a realization that there were. Well, maybe I did have a realization that there was a union. I had a realization, certainly, that there were suddenly limits that were established on what could be done to and with you. I remember shooting The Squaw Man with C.B. DeMille, maybe 33, 34, early on. And there was a very early on. I'm not sure the Guild was a factor in this, but I did. Yes, you got a certain amount of time off for lunch. You later on there was you could only be under the lights for so long. At 5 o'clock they had to stop. The kids couldn't work after that. I had a sense of that kind of control, a kind of protection, but I didn't realize what it was. I do remember being protected and feeling very much the center of attention, which was not welcome by me at all. Shooting The Squaw Man with C.B. DeMille in Castle Hot Springs, Arizona. And there were a lot of local people, onlookers and tourists wanting to see Mr. DeMille shoot this film. I mean, you know C.B. DeMille. And we were out in the desert. I remember he would walk along the desert and just kind of look and then sit down, expecting this chair would be underneath him, and it always was. Astonishing. I always wondered what would happen if his chair weren't there. He would have gone right on his ass is what would have happened, and it would have been hell to pay. But there was always somebody behind him with the chair. And he was showing off a little bit for the tourists on this day. He was not one of my great favorites. And he had his puttees and he had his riding crop and he was whacking along. And we had just finished a scene in which I was supposed to have roped a steer. I was like 6, 7. And I had this little calf, poor thing. And anyway, I bulldozed this calf. We were both exhausted, the calf and I, by the end of the scene. And it was all over, and there were a lot of people standing around. And DeMille said, "Young man, I didn't care for the way you did that last scene." And for some inexplicable reason, totally out of character, I said, "Who cares?" Well, there was total silence. I mean, my good Lord, And he turned purple. And he raised his riding crop as if to strike me. I thought he was going to hit me. And Mrs. West, the teacher, the tutor on his lot, ran up, grabbed me, pulled me, and turned to him in front of all these people and said, "You touch that child, this picture closes." She said, "We're through shooting for the day." She took me back into the hacienda. She said, "Dickie dear, don't worry about it. He was wrong. He was not nice to you. You did nothing wrong. My mother was hysterical. I mean, she wasn't weeping and shrieking and crying, but she was so nervous and so afraid because I had defied authority. And this wasn't, this wasn't my bag. I don't know where this came from. But it was not my usual performance. I remember once I read many years later that Butch Jenkins, when Jimmy Fiddler, the Hollywood gossip columnist, came to interview him on the MGM lot, that Butch Jenkins kicked him in the shins. And I wanted to write a fan letter to Butch Jenkins. I never did. We never did get to meet, but I admired him always.
Amongst the books that you've written, Dick, one of them in the late 70s, Opportunities in Acting Careers, you devoted 2 full chapters to unions. Where did this depth of knowledge and involvement come from?
Well, I think it started with Ralph Bellamy when he was president of Equity. He was a very committed, active president. He had a vision for the organization. He stood by that. And I was also, and in working there on the magazine and kind of creating a public relations and a legislative department, I began to realize how really important and what an integral part of the actor's life, the performer's life, and any performer, not just actors, their union affiliations are. And in terms of my experience in studying acting with just about everybody and just about every place I could at one time or another, and also in visiting colleges and finding out a little bit about what the curricula was, they would teach you everything except the reality of the business. And it's wonderful to be able to act, but you also really have to have some knowledge of what goes into managing and furthering a career. And I'm a committed trade unionist. And I guess my politics have always been, more liberal than conservative, but sort of liberal, middle of the road. But I have a deep belief in unions. And in terms of the equity experience, when we would go to Washington at that time in the 50s, I would have an opportunity to meet with and even participate sometimes in meetings with George Meany, and really, really brilliant people, and participate in the founding of the National Endowment for the Arts, and testify before congressional committees, or maybe help write that testimony. And I just came to realize what an integral and important part of the actor's life his unions are. The Guild, Actors Equity, AFTRA. It would be a very sorry time without them. AFTRA had a president, an actor named Ken Harvey once. A wonderful man, soap opera actor. And Ken had a phrase that has always stuck with me. He said, "Our unions built a floor in the jungle." And I think really that says it all. Some people get to the point where they become really major stars and can earn millions of dollars in a picture now, and have no particular interest in the union. And others get to that point and maintain their interest. People like Jack Lemmon, who has never lost his E.G. Marshall. I mean, you're just really wonderful people who've retained that commitment. And I knew and worked with both Bellamy and Jimmy Cagney. And just hearing them talk and hanging around and listening to what went on before, one has to appreciate the immense courage it took for these folks. Yes, they were stars, but they had no power. I mean, Louis Mayer and the Xanax and the Skanks, and these people had the power. And these guys and women who stuck their necks out when they could be broken like matchsticks just never cease to amaze me. And my admiration for them increases with the years. I remember once I was asked by someone in my capacity as public relations, didn't I think it was terrible that Johnny Carson was making X millions of dollars and here were so many people going hungry? And didn't I think it was terrible that, I forgot who it was, maybe it was Tyrone Power or someone, was getting all this money when there were so many people that were out of work. And why did they deserve to have all that money when so many other people were working even harder? And I remember saying, well, let me ask you, The Tonight Show sells commercial time for $160,000 a minute, or whatever it was at that point, I knew. I said, do you really think that a sponsor would pay that much to see Fred Silverman on The Tonight Show? Or Daryl Zanuck in a movie? Would you go buy a ticket to see Daryl Zanuck in a movie? Well, they sort of humfed and went the other way. But I don't think that an actor can be paid too much. I think that our unions did build a floor in the jungle. But beyond that, they've done much, much more. And I think that the people in this business in front of the camera who have real substance and real longevity are the ones that understand and appreciate that.
You wrote another book, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but don't have sex or take the car. There's got to be a story behind that title. It's obvious, but maybe it isn't.
Well, I don't know. The book was an attempt to describe the Hollywood studio system as seen through the eyes of its child actors. The oldest person in the book was Lillian Gish. I interviewed them all. Some of them I spent days with. I spent 3 days with Coogan in Palm Springs, Jackie Coogan, which was a remarkable experience. He was an astonishing man. Fearless. This was later in his life, of course. And the youngest was Natalie Wood. It was just before Natalie died that we did our interview. I think it was her last. And I was looking for a common thread, that kind of rosebud in Citizen Kane that kind of defines the life. And I found several. And the title was meant to, Gene Reynolds told me, he was in the book, Gene Reynolds told me that he felt that the title was capricious and not worthy of the book. He thought that the book was a more serious, important piece of work, which greatly flattered me, than the title indicated. But I don't agree. I mean, I don't think life is all that serious. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, it gives you permission and exhorts you to be wonderful and to be charming and to shine and to earn. But don't change. Don't become something that is not going to be a useful commodity as you get older. And of course, that's the conundrum. That's that's the dichotomy of the life, is that you are adored for being something that must inevitably become something else unless you're going to die in childhood. And that's what the title meant.
That's a wonderful title.
Thank you.
I loved it.
Thank you.
To wrap this up, how would you wrap it up?
Oh, I wouldn't wrap it up at all. And frankly, I wouldn't have had it any other way, because I'm a firm believer that wherever you are now, wherever you are and whatever you are, you wouldn't be there if every other thing in your life hadn't happened to you. And had I not done everything I did, including make some major mistakes in my personal life. And have 2 failed marriages. And have done some things that I really wish I hadn't done. And not done some things that I really wish I had.